Shabbat Shalom. Yesterday was an extraordinary day for me. It was at one time among the sweetest days I've encountered in many years, and at the same time among the hardest. I had my own little Tuesdays with Maury on a Thursday in an apartment in New York City. Yesterday I met with an old professor of mine who isn't actually so old. He's only about 66. He was one of my teachers 20 years ago when I first started rabbinical school. And today he is living with an illness that will eventually take him. He has an illness called PSP. Marcia, I think you're the only physician in the room. You know what PSP is?
No, offhand.
It's one that's not well known. It's on the spectrum with ALS and Parkinson's. And it slowly robs him of his ability to move, and ultimately it will rob him of his ability to live. Alan Schranz is a rabbi who first served a congregation in New Jersey, then in San Francisco, and then in Los Angeles, and then taught for a little while, and then a congregation in New York City. When I began rabbinical school, I began in the conservative movement at the University of Judaism in LA. I was a bit of a fish out of water. First of all, I was hardly an LA kind of person, and still am hardly kind of an LA person. But beyond that, the conservative movement, though it was the movement of my upbringing, was never quite home to me. The conservative movement felt like a place that had a sole focus on Jewish law. And not that Jewish law isn't important, I believe it is. But too often, at least in my view, the movement looked at law instead of people. And I knew it wasn't the right thing for me, and the question was, could I figure out a way to carve my own niche in all of this? And so for 2 years, I was a student in that movement, and I wrestled with it. Alan had been a rabbi at a major synagogue and had left that synagogue and was teaching, and Alan was different than the other professors. The rest of the professors would come in, they'd grab their lunch or their breakfast and go sit in the faculty room. Alan would sit down with the students. The rest of the professors would carry themselves with dignity, though they would dress a little shabbily, and they would barely talk to the students. Alan was the opposite. Alan dressed to the nines. Alan taught all of us to find the sale at Barney's to get a suit. None of us could afford a suit at Barney's, but he taught us to do it. And Alan would sit with us at breakfast and at lunch and at dinner. Between classes, he wouldn't stay in his office. He'd come out and sit where the students were and talk with the students. And he was a rabbi to us. And in a place where the academics of it all made it feel like it was missing humanity, Alan was human. And it was a gift that many of us treasured then and still treasure today. It is Alan who is responsible for me standing here before you tonight as a Reform rabbi. It was Alan who said to me one day, as I was passing his office in the hallway, "Why don't you look at HUC? Why don't you become a Reform rabbi?" And my initial response was, "But I'm not a Reform Jew." And he responded with words that I can't repeat from the pulpit. And he motioned me to come into his office, and I came in, and he said, "Sit down." I sat down, and he said, "Move that pile of books off from the chair," closed the door, he did all that, and he leaned into me and gave me more words that I can't repeat on the pulpit. And he had my attention. And it wasn't that Alan didn't have a colorful vocabulary, because he did then and he still does. And to spend time with him yesterday was, on the one hand, getting little snippets of the Alan I remember, but on the other hand, watching an Alan who had a hard time standing up, who had a home health aide with him the whole time, who needed to put a helmet on to walk to the bathroom in case he would fall, who went from wearing these gorgeous Barney suits to things that would be easy to clean in case he spilled on them, to the simplest of pants and a shirt that it was a different world. But as soon as Alan got to talking, the old Alan came back. And the sharpness of his mind and the inquisitiveness of it and the rabbi in him came flying back out. And there was Alan sitting teaching me all over again. And so we sat first in his breakfast room and then in his living room for a couple of hours, reliving days in the past, but also talking about what I'm doing now. And it was sort of saying, "So tell me, how has the rabbinate turned out for you? What are your challenges? What do you like? How are things going?" That it happened this week, I believe, was no accident. I've been going to New York this year a number of times. I've been part of a fellowship that I'll talk about more at some other point. And each of those the fellowship involves conferences in the city. This was the 4th visit. Certainly, I could have scheduled trips to see him any of the other times. I didn't. And I didn't understand why until yesterday, actually. I was sitting there listening to him and recalling all he had done for me and thinking, too, about the Torah portion this week. And it hit me. Alan taught me a truth that comes from this Torah portion alone that I have flown by in every year I've read this Torah portion since I can remember. And I'm willing to bet it's a truth that most of us fly right by when we read this Torah portion. Bahalotecha talks about the building of the Mishkan and the building of the tabernacle. And it talks about the menorah, which becomes the symbol of the Jewish people. We all have seen the menorah. This is not the Chanukiah, the 9-candle one, but rather the 7-candle menorah. 7 lights. It's the symbol of the state of Israel. And if I ask you, what does it symbolize? Somebody will shout back, it's the 7 days of creation. And 7's an important number in our world. And you're right. And until yesterday, that was what I thought it meant as well. But yesterday, Alan taught me something. And we never talked about this, actually. This came afterwards, as much in the cab ride as anything else. Those 7 lights together make 1 light. But the 7 are each unique and separate. Those 7 different lights don't exist on their own. Our symbol is not 1 light or 3 lights or 7 different lights around the room. It is 7 that are unified together. That notion, in my world, in my mind, brought me to an interesting point. First, that ours is a world that needs a unified vision and a unified voice, but it also needs to understand the notion of multiple possibilities. That we need the unified vision of one faith, of one belief in one God, but we need the different perspectives that each of us bring through our own lives and our own experiences. More than multiple possibilities, we need to recognize that each of us carry within us multiple views. And so the view I have today isn't the same one that I had 20 years ago when I was a student in Alan's class. And the view that he had then as my teacher is not the view he had yesterday, even though, once again, he was my teacher. We each have within us multiple views. And that leads us to the most important lesson of all. There are multiple truths. Those 7 candles represent 7 separate truths, 7 separate lights that by themselves carry power, but when brought together into one whole, have sanctity and bring something much deeper and much more important to each of us. The Talmud understands this in a conversation about a particular legal question that's a whole complicated thing, but the line comes in Talmud, Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim. These and those are both the words of a living God. Our Talmud understands this. Our tradition understands this. This truth and that truth are both holy. The law might follow this one in this case and that one in that case, but they're both holy. They're both sacred. Alan taught me when he said you should go become a Reform rabbi that the path you're currently on isn't the only way to reach the goal you want to reach. And that you've got to be willing to explore and try new things. And you've got to be willing to go find truth in a place that you didn't think you could find it originally. When he first said it to me, I thought he was nuts. There are times later I've still thought he was nuts. And to be honest, the switch from conservative to reform wasn't a perfect one. It was never a panacea. I knew that walking in. You trade one set of issues for another. Sort of like trading one used car for another one. The new one might be a little newer, have a few less miles on it, but it's still going to have problems. You're still going to have to replace a tire that you blow out sooner or later. And so it is. There is truth here and there is truth there. The question is, what's the truth here? And how do I use that understanding of truth to help me operate here and there and there and there and there in a way that brings holiness to the world? So how do we do that? Well, I watched my teacher. I watched him struggling. I said to him, if you could give one more sermon, what would you do? Preaching was always his favorite thing, which was very sad on one occasion. Alan was applying to pulpit jobs when we were in school, and we knew about it a little bit. He would talk about, I'm thinking about going to this city or that city. There was one pulpit he applied to in the Los Angeles metro, and a bunch of us went to hear him when he led services and gave a sermon. The cantor, forgive me, I don't mean to offend cantors. The cantor was an elderly man, not elderly, an older man, and they had lapel mics. And so Alan got up to stand and give his sermon, and all of a sudden we started to hear this strange sound in the room. We couldn't figure out what it was. And then somebody leaned over and realized it was the cantor who had fallen asleep behind where Alan was and was snoring. And so there was the sound of the snoring, just like that. Thankfully, Alan didn't take the job. I don't know if it was offered or not. And Alan it didn't even affect him. He just flew right through it. Alan was teaching us at that moment to be true to yourself, to find your own truth and to follow it. And so that truth, his truth and that synagogue's truth might not have meshed, but he knew the truth was there and he'd find it. Turns out he did at Sutton Place Synagogue in New York near the UN. But as I watched him yesterday, I said to him, if you could give one more sermon, what would it be? He said, I'd talk about my illness. I said, do you feel trapped? How do you deal with it? He said, no, I don't feel trapped at all. So how do you do it? He said, Dan, what can I do? I've long accepted it. It is what it is. This is who I am now. I can't change it. I said, so what would you preach? He said, I'd preach how everybody else sees it. My truth I understand. I want them to see the truth and find their own with it. My wife still wrestles with it. My kids accept it, but my kids knew that sooner or later their parents were going to go, as every child knows. But I'd want to teach what this illness taught me about my own truth, and about accepting my truth, and about helping others accept truth too. And there I was sitting listening to him, and I had read through the portion a number of times. Jeff and I had talked it through at length, preparing for his bar mitzvah tomorrow, and I had never once stopped to think that those 7 lights could be 7 truths. And there it was in front of me. And so my teacher was teaching me again, and I was again his student. I'm not sure who was happier to return to that relationship. I think I might have been, but I'm not sure. I know this. I'll never look at a menorah the same way, ever. And I hope that each of us, when we see that 7-branched candelabrum, and we see the symbol of the state of Israel, will instead of seeing one stubborn sign, will instead see possibilities, different paths of holiness that can find a way to come together, that can share one root, one branch, and can together shine light for everyone. Because if we do that, then not only are the words of Talmud Divrei Elohim Chaim, but the words of Torah become words of the living God, and they become words of living humanity and living Judaism. And that, after all, is the truth we seek. So I wish you a Shabbat of light, but of light from many sources, and a week of peace. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.